They told her she was nothing without them. But 7 years later, she would become the one thing they could never control again. Before anyone in that dining room realized what they had done, before the silence hardened into something permanent, before regret had a chance to take root, Emily Carter had already made her decision. The chandelier above the long oak table cast a warm golden glow, reflecting off polished plates and crystal glasses, creating the illusion of comfort, of family, of belonging. But beneath that soft light, something colder lingered, something sharp and invisible, like a quiet storm waiting to break. Emily sat at the far end of the table, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her posture straight but careful, as if taking up less space might somehow make the tension disappear. At 31, she had learned how to exist without drawing attention, how to speak only when spoken to, how to smile just enough to avoid questions. Across from her, Daniel Carter leaned back in his chair, confident and relaxed, the kind of ease that came from always being the center of approval, his tailored shirt crisp, his watch catching the light every time he moved. Beside him, Margaret Carter observed everything with a quiet authority, her gaze sharp, her expression composed in a way that made it clear she did not expect to be challenged. Conversations drifted around the table, business updates, vacation plans, subtle comparisons disguised as casual remarks. But every so often, like a pattern no one acknowledged out loud, the focus returned to Emily. "So, Emily," Daniel said, his voice light but edged with something deliberate, "still at that same job?" A small pause followed, just long enough for others to glance her way. Emily nodded slightly. "Yes." Her voice was soft, controlled. "I like it." Daniel smirked faintly, exchanging a look with their mother. "Like it?" he repeated, as if testing the words for weight and finding them lacking. Margaret set her fork down with precise calm. "Liking something isn't the same as building something," she said, her tone measured, almost gentle, but carrying an unmistakable judgment beneath it. "At some point, Emily, you have to ask yourself what you're really doing with your life." The air shifted, subtle but undeniable. No one spoke. No one intervened. Emily felt the familiar pressure settle in her chest, not sudden, not overwhelming, but steady, like something that had been there for years, growing quietly, layer by layer. She looked around the table, at the faces that were supposed to know her, to understand her, and saw only expectation, comparison, quiet dismissal. Her fingers tightened slightly against her palms, the only sign of the storm rising beneath her calm exterior. "I am doing something," she said, her voice still soft, but this time it didn't retreat. It stayed, it held. For a moment, the room stilled. Then Daniel let out a short laugh, not loud, not aggressive, just enough to dissolve the weight of her words. "Come on, Emily," he said, shaking his head, "we're just trying to help." Margaret's gaze sharpened, her patience thinning by a fraction. "Helping means being honest," she replied. "And the truth is, you've always been comfortable settling." The word settled landed heavier than it should have, echoing in the quiet space that followed. Emily felt something shift inside her, something small but irreversible, like a door closing somewhere deep within. She straightened slightly, her eyes steady now, no longer searching for approval. "Maybe," she said quietly, "I don't measure my life the same way you do." The response didn't spark anger, it sparked something worse. Disapproval. Margaret leaned back, her expression cooling. "Without this family," she said, each word deliberate, "you wouldn't have had the opportunities you've had. You should remember that." The room went silent. Not the comfortable kind, not the kind that allowed space for reflection, but the kind that pressed down, that made every breath feel heavier. Emily looked at her mother, really looked this time, and in that moment, she understood something she had avoided for years. This wasn't temporary. This wasn't misunderstanding. This was how they saw her, and it wasn't going to change. She nodded once, slowly, as if acknowledging a truth that had finally made itself clear. No one noticed the way her hands relaxed, the way her shoulders lowered, the way the tension didn't disappear but transformed into something quieter, something stronger. They continued their conversation soon after, the moment passing for them, absorbed into the rhythm of the evening, but for Emily, everything had already shifted. Because while they believed they were reminding her of her place, they had no idea they were witnessing the exact moment she chose to walk away from it forever. The room carried on as if nothing had happened, but something had. And this time, she wasn't going to stay. The next morning, nothing in the Carter house felt different, and that was exactly what made it unbearable. Sunlight streamed through the tall kitchen windows, illuminating spotless marble countertops and neatly arranged appliances. Everything in its place, everything controlled, everything untouched by the quiet fracture that had formed the night before. Emily stood near the doorway, her small suitcase resting beside her, its wheels still carrying faint traces of dust from the driveway, as if even it understood that this was not a temporary departure. Margaret moved through the kitchen with her usual precision, pouring coffee into a porcelain cup, the soft clink of ceramic against glass breaking the silence in measured intervals. She did not look at Emily. Not once. Daniel scrolled through his phone at the island, dressed sharply as always, already prepared for a day that would continue exactly as planned, because for him, nothing had shifted. "You are leaving early," Margaret said finally, her voice calm, observational, as if commenting on the weather rather than acknowledging her daughter's presence at the edge of the room. Emily nodded. Yes. That was all. No explanation. No justification. The simplicity of her answer seemed to irritate something unspoken. Margaret set her cup down carefully, turning just enough to face her. "Running away does not solve anything," she said, her tone controlled but firm, the kind of statement meant to reassert authority without raising volume. Emily did not react the way she once would have. She did not shrink. She did not rush to defend herself. She simply stood there, her expression steady, her eyes clear in a way that felt unfamiliar even to her. "I am not running," she replied quietly. Daniel let out a soft exhale, barely masking his impatience. "Then what are you doing?" he asked, finally looking up, his voice carrying that same dismissive edge from the night before, taking some kind of break from reality. Emily met his gaze, and for a brief second, something in the room shifted, subtle but undeniable. "No," she said, "I am stepping away from it." The words landed differently this time, not defensive, not emotional. Final. Margaret's expression hardened almost imperceptibly, her posture straightening as if bracing against something she refused to acknowledge. "You are making a mistake," she said. "The world does not work the way you think it does. You will find that out very quickly." Emily nodded once, accepting the statement without argument, because for the first time, she no longer needed their approval to define her reality. She reached for the handle of her suitcase, the motion slow and deliberate, the quiet click of the wheels echoing faintly against the hardwood floor as she pulled it forward. No one moved to stop her. No one offered to help. No one said goodbye. The absence of those things spoke louder than anything else. At the front door, she paused, not because she hesitated, but because she understood the weight of the moment, the invisible line she was about to cross. Behind her, the house remained still, composed, untouched by consequence, or at least pretending to be. She turned the handle, the cool metal pressing against her palm, and stepped outside into the open air, where the morning felt different, wider, less controlled, like something she had not realized she was missing. The door closed softly behind her. No dramatic slam, no raised voices, just a quiet, irreversible separation. Inside, Margaret returned to her coffee, Daniel to his phone, the routine resuming as if nothing had happened, but somewhere beneath that surface, a subtle tension lingered, something neither of them could quite name. Outside, Emily adjusted her grip on the suitcase and walked down the driveway, each step steady, each breath measured, the distance between her and the house growing 1 yard at a time, then 10, then 20, until the place that had once defined her became just another structure behind her. She did not look back. Not once. And in that quiet departure, without confrontation, without spectacle, she did something far more powerful than they would understand for years to come. She removed herself completely. The silence she left behind was not empty, it was waiting. For the first few days, the silence felt louder than anything Emily had ever experienced. Not the heavy silence of judgment she had left behind, but an unfamiliar emptiness that stretched across every hour, every decision, every quiet moment she had to face alone. The small apartment she rented on the edge of a Midwestern town was barely 600 square feet, with thin walls and a single window that overlooked a narrow parking lot. Nothing like the spacious home she had grown up in, but for the first time, the space felt entirely hers. No expectations, no comparisons, no quiet assessments waiting behind every word. She placed her suitcase against the wall, leaving it unopened for a full day, as if acknowledging that unpacking would make everything permanent. The first night, she slept on top of the covers, still dressed, her mind replaying fragments of the past, her mother's voice, Daniel's laughter, the subtle dismissals that had once felt normal and now echoed differently in the absence of their presence. By morning, something had shifted again, not dramatically, not visibly, but enough to push her forward. She found work within a week, a modest administrative position at a local logistics company just off the highway, where trucks came and went in steady rhythm, carrying goods to places she had never seen, the hum of engines replacing the quiet tension she had known for years. The office was simple, functional, with fluorescent lights and rows of desks, but no one there knew her past, no one measured her against anything except the work she completed. At first, she spoke little, keeping her head down, observing, learning the patterns, the systems, the way people interacted without hidden expectations. Her supervisor, a woman named Karen Mitchell, valued efficiency over appearance, results over assumptions, and for the first time, Emily found herself being acknowledged without judgment, not praised excessively, not criticized unfairly, just seen for what she did. Weeks turned into months, and the routine began to take shape: early mornings, long hours, quiet evenings where she taught herself new skills. Reading, studying, pushing past the limits that had once been placed on her without her realizing it. There were moments when doubt crept in, when the absence of her family felt less like freedom and more like loss, especially during holidays when the town slowed down and the streets grew quieter, when the idea of belonging resurfaced in unexpected ways. But each time that thought appeared, it was met with another, steadier voice, one that reminded her why she had left, why she had chosen silence over submission. She did not call. She did not write. Days passed without any contact, then weeks, then months, until the absence itself became a statement stronger than any argument she could have made. Back in the Carter house, her name surfaced occasionally, not with concern, but with a kind of controlled dismissal, as if acknowledging her too much would give her departure more significance than they were willing to allow. Margaret would mention her in passing, her tone neutral, her words carefully chosen to maintain the narrative that Emily had simply chosen a different, less ambitious path. Daniel, when asked, would shrug, offering vague responses that carried no real curiosity. But beneath that surface, something subtle began to shift, an absence that could not be fully explained, a space that no longer fit the structure they had built so carefully. They expected her to return. They believed time would correct her decision, that reality would bring her back, quieter, more compliant, more aligned with their expectations. What they did not realize was that with every passing day, every mile she created between herself and their influence, Emily was not just surviving. She was rebuilding something they had never allowed her to become. And while they waited for her return, convinced that she would eventually need them again, they had no idea that the version of her they once controlled was already gone. By the end of the first year, the version of Emily Carter who had once stood quietly at the edge of her own life no longer existed in any recognizable form, not because she had transformed overnight, but because she had rebuilt herself one deliberate choice at a time, each decision small on its own, yet together forming something steady, something undeniable. The logistics office that once felt temporary had become a place of quiet momentum, where her consistency began to stand out, not loudly, not dramatically, but in ways that could not be ignored. She arrived before most employees, left after the last shipment reports were finalized, and over time, She stopped simply following processes and started improving them, noticing inefficiencies others had accepted as routine, suggesting adjustments that made operations smoother, faster, more reliable. At first, her ideas were met with polite acknowledgement, the kind that allowed people to move on without change, but Emily did not retreat when ignored. She refined. She observed. She returned with better solutions, clearer reasoning, until eventually, people started listening, not because they were impressed by her confidence, but because the results spoke in ways confidence never had. Karen Mitchell began assigning her more responsibility, not as a favor, but as a recognition of capability. And with each new task, Emily felt something unfamiliar take root, not validation from others, but trust in her own judgment. Outside of work, her nights were no longer filled with doubt or quiet replaying of past conversations. They were structured, intentional, filled with online courses, certification programs, hours spent studying business operations, management systems, financial planning, areas she had once been told were beyond her reach. The apartment that once felt empty became a space of focus. The small kitchen table covered in notebooks, printed materials, a laptop that rarely powered down, the soft hum of effort replacing the silence that had once felt overwhelming. Time moved forward, steady and unremarkable on the surface, but beneath it, something significant was taking shape, something that could not be undone. By the third year, her title had changed, her responsibilities expanded, and her presence in the company carried weight, not because she demanded it, but because she had earned it in ways no one could dispute. She did not talk about her past. She did not explain where she came from. She simply worked, learned, and built, quietly assembling a life that belonged entirely to her. Meanwhile, miles away, the Carter house remained outwardly unchanged, its routines intact, its structure as controlled as ever, but the absence of Emily had not faded the way they expected. It lingered in subtle ways, in conversations that stopped a second too soon, in moments where comparisons no longer landed the same without her presence, in the quiet realization that the role she once filled could not be replaced, only left empty. Margaret maintained her composure, her narrative unchanged, presenting Emily's departure as a choice rooted in weakness, a decision that would eventually correct itself. But even she could not fully ignore the passing of time, the growing distance that no longer felt temporary. Daniel, for all his confidence, found himself mentioning her less often, not out of indifference, but because the absence no longer fit neatly into the story he had created. They expected struggle. They expected failure. They expected a return shaped by necessity. What they did not see was the reality unfolding far beyond their view, a reality where Emily was no longer defined by what she lacked, but by what she had built, piece by piece, without them. And while they continued to believe that time would bring her back, they had no idea that time was doing something far more irreversible. It was making her impossible to return as the person they once controlled. The room they had left for her was still there, but the person who would have filled it was not. By the 5th year, Emily no longer needed to prove anything to anyone, and that was precisely when everything began to change. The same office that had once been a place of quiet learning had transformed into a space where her decisions shaped outcomes far beyond her desk, her name appearing in meetings she was not even present in, her systems adopted across departments that had once overlooked her entirely. The logistics company expanded steadily, and with that growth came pressure, deadlines, and the kind of challenges that revealed who could adapt and who could not. Emily did not raise her voice. She did not demand recognition. She simply solved problems, one after another, with a clarity that others began to rely on without realizing it. When a major distribution error threatened to delay shipments across 3 states, she was the one who stayed late, mapping routes, reorganizing schedules, working through the night until the system stabilized again. The next morning, no announcement was made, no applause followed, but the operations ran smoothly and everyone felt the difference. Karen noticed. The executives noticed. And slowly, without ceremony, Emily moved into a leadership role that had once seemed far beyond her reach, not because she chased it, but because she had already been doing the work long before the title arrived. Outside of work, her life had grown just as deliberately, her small apartment replaced with a modest but well-kept home on the outskirts of town, a place with enough space for quiet reflection and continued growth, where her evenings were no longer defined by survival, but by intention. She invested carefully, learned relentlessly, and built stability in ways that no one had ever taught her, creating a foundation that did not depend on approval or validation from anyone else. There were still moments when the past surfaced, not with pain, but with clarity, like distant echoes that no longer had power over her present. She did not reach out. She did not check on them. The silence had become complete, not forced, not defensive, but natural, like a chapter that had fully closed. Back in the Carter house, time had not been as kind to certainty as they had expected. The structure remained, the routines unchanged, but the confidence that once defined their perspective had begun to show small fractures. Margaret found herself revisiting conversations in her mind, not openly, not in a way she would admit, but in quiet moments when control was no longer being performed, questioning details she had once dismissed. Daniel's career continued, but the effortless confidence he carried had softened slightly, replaced by a subtle awareness that not everything unfolded as predictably as he had always believed. When Emily's name came up, it no longer carried the same dismissive tone, but neither of them knew how to address the growing gap between what they had expected and what had actually happened. They had assumed time would weaken her independence, that distance would create need, that eventually she would return shaped by the world into someone more aligned with their expectations. Instead, the opposite had occurred. Time had strengthened her. Distance had clarified her, and somewhere beyond their reach, she had built something that no longer required them at all. They did not know where she was. They did not know what she had become. But they could feel, in ways they could not fully explain, that the version of Emily they once understood was no longer accessible to them. And while they remained in the same place, holding onto the same assumptions, the distance between them was no longer measured in miles or years. It was measured in something far more permanent. It was measured in who she had become without them. By the 7th year, Emily Carter no longer measured time by distance from the past, but by the strength of everything she had built in its absence. And it was in that quiet, steady life that something unexpected finally disrupted the silence she had maintained for so long. It arrived not as a dramatic moment, not as a confrontation, but as a simple email, its subject line direct and unremarkable, yet carrying a weight that immediately shifted the air around her. She read it once, then again, her expression unchanged, her posture still, but something behind her eyes sharpened, not with emotion, but with recognition. The message came from a legal firm based in the same city she had left behind, informing her of a pending matter involving family assets, requiring her presence for a formal discussion. There were no personal words attached, no apology, no attempt to bridge the silence that had stretched for years, only a professional request that assumed her compliance, as if time had not altered the dynamic at all. She closed her laptop slowly, her fingers resting for a moment against the edge of the table, the faint hum of the room filling the space where hesitation might have once existed. But there was none. Not anymore. Across town, in an office lined with polished wood and framed achievements, Margaret Carter sat across from an attorney, her posture composed, her tone controlled, discussing the same matter with the same quiet authority she had always carried. To her, this was procedural, necessary, something to be handled efficiently and without unnecessary complication. Emily's presence was a formality, a requirement that would be resolved like any other detail. Daniel stood near the window, his hands in his pockets, listening with a focus that appeared calm but lacked the ease it once held. Neither of them spoke about the years that had passed. Neither of them acknowledged the silence that had defined that time. Instead, they framed the situation in practical terms, assuming that when Emily walked into the room, she would do so within the same structure they had always known. But assumptions, like control, have a way of collapsing when they are left unchallenged for too long. Back in her home, Emily stood by the window, looking out over the quiet stretch of land that had become her refuge, her mind not racing, not conflicted, but clear in a way that only distance could create. She understood what this meant. Not just the legal matter, but the moment itself, the intersection of two completely different versions of her life. The past had reached out, not with emotion, not with understanding, but with expectation. And for the first time in 7 years, she was being asked to step back into a space that once defined her. She did not respond immediately. She did not rush to decide. Instead, she allowed the silence to exist, the same silence that had once protected her, now serving a different purpose. That evening, she sat at her desk, the email open once more, the words unchanged, but their meaning entirely different. She was no longer the person who would have read them with uncertainty, no longer the one who would have questioned her place in that room. She had built something beyond it, something independent of it, something that could not be diminished by stepping back into it. When she finally closed the laptop, the decision had already been made, not in that moment, but over the course of every year she had spent becoming someone they no longer understood. She would go. Not because they expected her to, and not because she needed anything from them, but because this time, she would walk into that room on her own terms. And somewhere, without realizing it yet, they had just invited the one person they could no longer control back into their world. The outcomes, however, would not be what they remembered. The morning she returned to the city she had left behind did not feel dramatic, and that was precisely what made it powerful, because there was no hesitation in her steps, no visible weight in her expression, only a quiet certainty that had taken years to build and could not be undone in a single day. The streets looked the same, the buildings unchanged, the rhythm of the place continuing as if nothing had ever shifted, yet for Emily, everything was different, not in the world around her, but in the way she moved through it. She arrived early, not out of anxiety, but out of habit, the same discipline that had shaped her life now guiding her through a moment that once would have overwhelmed her. The law office stood tall, its glass exterior reflecting the morning light, polished and precise, the kind of place designed to project authority before a single word was spoken. Inside, the air carried that familiar quiet tension, the soft echo of footsteps across marble floors, the muted conversations behind closed doors, the subtle awareness that everything here was controlled, measured, deliberate. Emily stepped inside without breaking stride, her posture steady, her gaze level, acknowledging the receptionist with a simple nod that required no explanation. She gave her name, her voice calm, clear, without the softness that had once defined it. For a brief moment, the receptionist paused, scanning the appointment list, then looked up again, something flickering across her expression as recognition settled in, not of who Emily had been, but of the importance attached to the name she had just spoken. "They are expecting you," she said, her tone shifting slightly, more attentive now, more careful. Emily did not react. She simply followed the indicated direction, her steps quiet but deliberate, the sound of her heels marking each second with a rhythm that felt almost intentional. In the conference room, Margaret Carter sat at the head of the table, composed as always, her posture flawless, her expression neutral, as if this were just another meeting, another detail to be handled efficiently. Daniel stood near the window, his reflection faint against the glass, his presence still confident but no longer effortless. Neither of them looked toward the door immediately. They expected an entrance they understood, one shaped by the past, one that fit within the structure they had always maintained. The door opened. The sound was soft, controlled, but it cut through the room with a clarity that made both of them turn. And for the first time in 7 years, they saw her. Not the version they remembered, not the one who sat quietly at the edge of conversations, not the one who measured her words to avoid conflict, but someone entirely different, someone who carried herself with a stillness that did not ask for permission to exist. Emily stepped inside and closed the door behind her, the motion smooth, unhurried, as if sealing the space between what had been and what was about to unfold. No one spoke. The room held its breath in a silence that felt heavier than any argument. Daniel opened his mouth slightly, as if to say something, but no words came. Margaret's eyes remained fixed on Emily, searching for something familiar, something she could categorize, something she could control, but finding none of it. Emily did not fill the silence. She did not offer explanation or acknowledgement. She simply took a seat, her movements precise, her presence undeniable. And in that moment, without a single word spoken, everything they believed about her began to unravel. The room went completely still, and for the first time, it was not Emily who felt small. The attorney cleared his throat first, not because he needed to speak, but because the silence had stretched long enough to become uncomfortable, and in rooms like this, discomfort demanded resolution. He adjusted the stack of documents in front of him, his movements precise, professional, yet even he seemed to sense that this meeting was not unfolding in the way it had been anticipated. "Thank you all for being here," he began, his voice measured, neutral, attempting to restore structure to a moment that had already shifted beyond control. Emily did not respond. She did not nod, did not offer acknowledgement, her attention resting calmly on the table in front of her, as if she had all the time in the world. Margaret straightened slightly, reclaiming her composure with practiced ease, the brief disruption already being absorbed into the controlled image she maintained. "Let us proceed," she said, her tone steady, her authority returning in form if not in substance. The attorney nodded and began outlining the matter at hand, a restructuring of family assets, a consolidation that required formal agreement from all parties involved. His words were clear, efficient, detailing percentages, ownership stakes, legal obligations, the kind of language that reduced complex relationships into measurable terms. Daniel leaned forward slightly, his attention sharpening as the details unfolded, his confidence beginning to return in familiar territory, where numbers and agreements followed predictable rules. Margaret listened without interruption, her expression unchanged, absorbing each point with the expectation that the outcome would align with the structure she had always controlled. And then, without raising her voice, without shifting her posture, Emily spoke. "That structure will not work." The words were quiet, but they cut through the room with a clarity that immediately halted the attorney mid-sentence. Daniel turned toward her, his expression tightening slightly, not in anger, but in something closer to disbelief. Margaret's gaze sharpened again, not with confusion this time, but with a controlled irritation, the kind that came from having expectations challenged in a space where they had always held. "This is a standard arrangement," Margaret replied, her tone firm, measured, the same tone that had once ended conversations before they began. Emily met her gaze without hesitation, her expression unchanged. "It may be standard," she said calmly, "but it is not equitable." The room went still again, but this silence was different. It was not filled with dismissal or indifference. It was filled with uncertainty. The attorney glanced between them, sensing the shift, his professional neutrality now carrying a hint of caution. "Ms. Carter," he said carefully, "could you clarify your concerns?" Emily did not rush her answer. She reached for the document in front of her, her fingers steady, her movements deliberate, as she turned a page and placed it back down with quiet precision. "The distribution assumes contribution based on a structure that no longer reflects reality," she said. "It also overlooks liabilities that have been deferred, not resolved." Daniel frowned slightly, his confidence faltering just enough to be noticeable. "What liabilities?" he asked, his tone controlled but edged now with something less certain. Emily's eyes shifted to him briefly, not with confrontation, but with a calm acknowledgement of the question. "Operational decisions made over the past 5 years that have impacted long-term valuation," she replied. "Decisions that were not disclosed in full within this summary." The attorney's posture changed almost imperceptibly, his attention sharpening as he looked back down at the documents, scanning details with renewed focus. Margaret's composure held, but something beneath it tightened, a realization beginning to form that this was no longer a formality, no longer a simple process to be managed. This was something else entirely. Emily leaned back slightly in her chair, her hands resting calmly in her lap, her presence steady, controlled, undeniable. She did not raise her voice. She did not argue. She simply understood the structure in front of her in a way they had not expected. And for the first time, Daniel did not have a response ready. He opened his mouth, then paused, the words stopping before they could form. Margaret remained silent, her gaze fixed, her control no longer absolute. The room, once defined by their authority, now felt different, its balance shifting in a way that could not be reversed. And in that quiet, measured moment, it became clear that Emily had not returned to fit into the structure they had built. She had returned to challenge it. And this time, she was not the one being evaluated. She was the one rewriting the terms. No one interrupted her after that, not because they agreed, but because for the first time, they could not immediately dismantle what she had said. And in a room where certainty had always belonged to Margaret and Daniel, that hesitation felt unfamiliar, almost disorienting. The attorney adjusted his glasses, reviewing the documents again with a level of scrutiny that had not been there before, his earlier confidence replaced by a quiet caution, as if he now understood that the assumptions guiding this meeting were no longer reliable. Daniel shifted slightly in his seat, his posture losing its effortless ease, his mind moving quickly through possibilities, calculations, trying to regain control of a situation that was no longer responding the way it always had. "If there are concerns," he began, his voice measured but tighter now, "we can review them after the initial agreement is in place." Emily did not look at him immediately. She let the suggestion settle in the room, allowed the weight of it to be felt before she responded. "No," she said simply. The word was not loud, not forceful, but it carried a finality that made the air feel heavier. "We address them now, or we do not move forward at all." The room went still again, the kind of stillness that does not come from silence alone, but from the realization that the rules have changed and no one knows who is setting them anymore. Margaret's gaze did not waver, but something beneath it had shifted, something that recognized this was no longer a discussion she could guide through tone or expectation. "You are overcomplicating a straightforward matter," she said, her voice controlled but lacking the quiet dominance it once held. Emily met her eyes fully now, and there was no trace of the hesitation that had once defined her. "It was never straightforward," she replied calmly. "It was just never questioned." The words landed without aggression, without accusation, yet they carried more weight than any raised voice could have. The attorney cleared his throat again, this time more carefully, as if aware that every word now carried consequence. "It would be prudent," he said slowly, "to revisit the financial disclosures before proceeding." Daniel looked toward him, surprise flashing briefly across his face, not because of the suggestion itself, but because of how quickly the alignment in the room had shifted. Margaret remained silent, her expression composed, but the pause that followed was longer than any she would have allowed in the past. Emily did not press further. She did not need to. The structure had already cracked, and everyone in the room could feel it. After a moment, she reached for her pen, signing nothing, making no gesture of agreement, simply placing it back down with the same quiet precision that had defined her every movement since she entered. Then she stood. The motion was unhurried, deliberate, as if she were stepping out of a space that no longer required her presence. "Have your team send the revised documents," she said, her voice even professional, leaving no room for interpretation. She did not wait for acknowledgement. She did not look back to see their reaction. She simply walked toward the door, her steps steady, the sound of them echoing softly against the polished floor, each one reinforcing what had already become clear. Behind her, no one spoke. Daniel remained seated, his expression fixed in a way that suggested he was still processing what had just occurred. Margaret sat perfectly still, her posture unchanged, but the certainty that once defined her presence now replaced by something quieter, something she could not immediately resolve. The attorney lowered his gaze to the documents, no longer treating them as routine. The door opened, then closed, and in the silence that followed, there was no victory announced, no confrontation resolved, no apology offered. Only a quiet, undeniable shift in power that no one in that room could ignore. Because the woman who had once been dismissed without a second thought had walked in, rewritten the terms, and left without needing their approval. And for the first time, they were the ones left trying to understand where they stood. And in that stillness, something became painfully clear. She had not come back to belong. She had come back to show them she never needed to.